on one hand, when, we sort of see Nolan explaining to Mark how Viltrumites fly and going through training and sort of giving him the breakdown of it all, when he says we don't need leverage, we can kind of just move through. I found myself almost like on a physical level reacting to that, going, but no, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, punch it.
Could you jump to light speed in that tin can? Go back in time in the DeLorean. Will it crash or take to the sky? Tell me, smart guy, does it fly?
Welcome to Does It Fly, the podcast that puts your favorite sci-fi properties, inventions, and conceits to the test. I'm your mad scientist, Hakeem Oluseyi.
And I'm your pop culture expert, Tamara Krinsky. Time to dive into today's topic and see, does it fly? Hello, Hakeem.
Hey, Tamara, good to see you again. And welcome back, all our friends. We are coming back at you with another, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Thank you, Tamara.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Does It Fly, the podcast where we talk about the science and story of your favorite conceits and tropes from various science fiction and fantasy, and even sometimes horror movies, which are the ones that scare me. But today we are not talking about horror. Although
Are you
there's
sure?
a lot of gore.
There's a little gore in this one. We're talking about Invincible.
I wasn't ready before. Now I am.
The name of our podcast is oddly appropriate for what we're
Yes.
going to be talking about. Okay, so just to get you started, a couple things. Invincible is an Amazon Prime series that started in 2021. It's based on the comic by Robert Kirkman, which he co-created with Cory Walker and Ryan Ottley. And if that name Robert Kirkman sounds familiar to you, I'm guessing you're a Walking Dead fan, because he also created the comic for that as well. And so the show is based on the comics. There have been 2 seasons so far. A 3rd season is coming out probably right around the time this episode is dropping. But it's actually been renewed for 4 seasons because it's been a hit. It's immensely popular. And we'll get more into that as we talk.
Yeah, I think the advent of adult animation is an awesome thing, right? It's like, as Gen Xers, we had our Willie and the Chopper Bunch, our G.I. Joe, and all these as kids. And I always said to myself, man, they should turn these comics into movies and TV shows. And now we're just awash in it. Now, we lost some other stuff because of this. But this one, because it's adult, it's not the standard, tropes of comics. It gets pretty, like, for example, there's no killing in a lot of comics.
There's killing in this. Okay,
There's
so
killing in this.
this is where we say, if you are not familiar with Invincible and you don't want spoilers from us, hit pause, go watch the show, watch some episodes, and then come back and watch or listen to us. And for those who may be a little bit unfamiliar with the series, just a little bit of background so you can follow along. So as Hakeem mentioned, Invincible is an adult animated series that focuses on Mark and Nolan Grayson. Nolan is Omni-Man, he's Mark's dad, and he is the most powerful superhero on Earth, or around Earth, so to speak. And Mark, we meet him when he's 17, and he is just coming into his powers. And first spoiler, which you learn very quickly, Mark learns that his dad is actually from another planet, Viltrum, and ostensibly is there to help Earth, but ultimately not so much. And so a lot of the series follows Mark as he's learning to get his powers. This is a world where where superheroes exist. People know superheroes. There are still secret identities. But we see Mark get to know other superheroes as he goes about his everyday high school life, trying to get the girl and hang with his friends, and suddenly has some conflicts between superhero life and teenage life.
Yeah, and family life, right? It really comes to a head. Him and his dad, he learns who his dad is, his dad's real purpose for being here, discovers that it's sinister. And Mark, it's sinister from the Earthling perspective, not necessarily from the Viltrumite perspective. And so here's the thing about these folks from Viltrum. They're powerful. They have superpowers, they have super durability, and they can fly. They can basically hover. And they give us a little bit of an explanation of how they fly.
We can freely move ourselves through physical space. That's how we fly. So we don't have to pivot on our feet and push off the ground. We can literally push off anything. We can create our own leverage.
And it makes no sense whatsoever. So we're going to get into the science of the flight of the Viltrumites.
That's right. And, for those of you who may also be fans of the comic, we'll reference the comics, but we're really focusing on how flight is portrayed in the animated television show. So that's kind of our bucket for today. So like I said, our title, Does It Fly? Oddly appropriate because we are talking about humanoid flight. The Viltrumites are humanoid in form, although they clearly have a lot of different powers and abilities than Earth humans, but we're going to talk about that general idea. So, Hakeem, what do you think? Does humanoid Viltrumite flight fly?
Well, I'm still thinking of the phrase flight of the Viltrumites. So I'm like, if there's any composers out here, that would make a great song title. Flight of the Viltrumites. Yeah. So, when you take something like this, how do these powered beings fly? This is another case of the producer saying, hey, Hakeem and Tamara, figure this one out, smarty pantses. So, it's one of those things where you can say, okay, this makes no sense. Beings without wings can't fly. But even beings with wings, right? There's many ways to achieve flight. The way a bird does it is not the way an insect does it, right? So it's a different physical process. So what this makes me think of is just that whole idea of flight at all. And what that brings me to is gravity. Because the only reason you need to fly is because gravity exists. But does it? And here's what I mean by that. Here's what I mean.
We're getting existential early on this one.
Existential
Usually wait until
early.
the vibes section to get existential.
Look, when you're manipulating space and time, it gets deep. And that's what they're doing. Because, we are compelled. Everyone knows. I know that's a phrase to avoid, everyone knows. But most of us have heard that an object at rest or in motion remains at rest or in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. That was big news when it was figured out in the 15th century, right? That was, people did not expect that because that is not what happened.
Special bulletin. We have a special bulletin about mass and force. Breaking news. Breaking news.
Breaking news. Because all of our senses, you see that if you don't move something, it stays put. And then when you move it, right, the harder you push it, the faster it goes. So whereas we know today that force equals mass times acceleration, forces creates accelerations, they thought that forces created speed. So those two steps of an object at rest or in motion remains at rest or in motion, and that the force creates a change in speed, not the speed, that broke everything open for humans. But it still took centuries before we had an idea of gravity. And those two things come into play because every day of your life, you've been feeling your weight, right? You're sitting in a chair, you feel your weight on your butt. You stand up, your weight is on your feet. And you think that gravity is pulling you down. Well, the laws of physics say that is not what's happening.
What is happening?
What's happening is that the ground is accelerating up. Now, why does that matter? Because an object, if I release something, it's going to start moving. And it's only going to stop when it reaches the ground. So when it's falling, it has no weight. It is weightless. So it's doing its object at rest or in motion, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So in order to stay stationary, there needs to be something accelerating it upwards because space-time compels you to follow the curvature of space-time, which is what we call gravity. So I know that sounds crazy. If the ground is accelerating upwards, why isn't the Earth getting bigger? So in the world of physics, we create this thing called a space-time diagram. Just like you have an XY plot, instead of X and Y, you have space and time. And so when you plot things in a gravitational field, what you see is that on a space-time diagram is that even for an object at rest, the ground accelerates upward to meet you. So here's a classic example for you to have experienced. If there's something circular and it's accelerating outwards or inwards, but yet the size does not change, how does that occur? It's called rotation. Just like you go to that carnival or fair and there's that spinning thing where you stand against the wall and it starts spinning faster,
Oh,
then
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
floor drops out.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That was my
So
favorite.
there you go. You're experiencing a centripetal acceleration that points at the central axis. So everybody is being accelerated toward the central axis. If the wall did not accelerate you in that direction, you would keep off going in a straight line, right? An object at rest, right? Keeps going that straight line. But that wall is constantly accelerating you toward the center, so you move in a circle. So everybody on that ride is against the wall. Everyone is being accelerated toward the center, but they're not getting closer together
And that is because
of the nature of the acceleration. When we think of acceleration, we think, oh, I'm getting faster. But the thing is that you don't have to get faster to accelerate. You could also change the direction that you're moving to
okay,
accelerate.
wait. So to help me break this down a little bit more. So we've got the ride metaphor.
Right.
So in this case, when you were
Yeah.
talking about Earth accelerating or ground accelerating up, is
Yeah.
planet Earth the ride?
That's right. Planet Earth's the ride. Planet Earth is the ride, and it's accelerating outward, but it's not getting any bigger. Just like on the ride, everything is accelerating inward, but the thing isn't getting any smaller, right? The Earth is accelerating outward, but it's not getting any bigger. The ground is,
So what's keeping both the ride from not getting smaller and the Earth from not getting bigger?
because the change of velocity is not due to a change in the speed of motion or your location. Is due to a change in your direction, right? So acceleration is a change of velocity, and a velocity has both a speed and a direction. You don't have to change the speed to accelerate. You can keep the speed the same, right? And so when we think of words like acceleration, we think, oh, if it's accelerating outwards, it should be getting bigger. But I give you that example to show you that no, if I have things on the opposite side of the Earth is accelerating outwards so that each person feels their weight on opposite sides, but still the Earth is not getting any bigger. So it doesn't really, it's hard to intuitively grasp. So in physics, we write these space-time diagrams and we roll them up into tubes. So we're like, oh, now I see it. So there's many examples online where, different science communicators are talking about this way of doing it. Because, this is how we do it in the trenches. And now people are like, let's show the public how it's done. And everybody watches and goes, oh, I get it. No, I don't.
All right. So what does this have to do with flight, with humanoid flight, and the way that this particular superpowered group of people can fly?
Yeah, exactly. So if you're going to hover in the presence of a gravitational body, what you're trying to say to yourself is, space-time, I am not going to do what you compel me to do, which is move through space-time at the speed of light. And, so they claim in the show that they use leverage. And, there's that old, who was it, Archimedes or someone who said, give me a lever in a solid state to place it, now move the Earth. Yeah, so they're using leverage on space, which makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, and just to break that down a little bit, like before, what they're actually saying is they don't, what Nolan explains to Mark is that they don't need leverage like normal humans do to move. They can just kind of go however they want. And they don't get real specific about that. Like if they're using the air for leverage or able to do something at a molecular level. So they don't get super specific. I mean, we know they do talk about having sort of an advanced inner ear construction, which helps with balance through the flying and the levitating, but there's no specific instruction. Okay, so back to they're using space for leverage.
They don't give you a specific instruction. So here's the question. If you're going to use space-time curvature to leverage against, what does that even mean? Is space a thing? Is it a substance?
And when
Well,
we say leverage, just,
yeah,
to kind of keep breaking it down, especially for the
yeah,
people who are listening and not watching our lovely video.
right,
Say leverage, we're talking about like when you're walking or when you go to jump, you have to push off of something. Like there's got
exactly,
to push against, which goes back to what you were talking about
exactly,
before with,
exactly.
the rules of physics. So, okay,
Yeah, you
back
got
to
to
what is
push
space time.
against something, and they're basically claiming that they're pushing against space itself. But that's what I was getting at. Is space a thing that you can push against? Well, here's the thing. When we look at something that normally flies, like an airplane, there is a force of lift. They have thrust that propels them through the air at a particular speed, and they have lift. If you look at something like a dirigible or a blimp, right? A balloon, they use buoyancy, okay, where less dense objects tend to rise. And then the third type of motion, like a satellite does or a spaceship, that's just plain following. So,
And what about, sorry,
yeah,
what about like an actual animal, like a bird?
yeah, so take for example an insect. Insects, they don't have that airfoil shape to their wing. So when
Mhm.
we calculated, oh, here's how birds fly, it's the shape of that wing that creates a lower pressure on the surface and underneath, and they
Mhm.
get lift. Well, when they looked at insects' wings, they're like, yo, these are flat. There's no airfoil shape. How do they do it? And it
Mhm.
turns out that when you create eddies in the air, these little whirlpools, those tend to have a lower pressure. So they generate lift by creating turbulence in the area above their wings,
I
right?
never knew that. That's so cool.
Yeah, I learned that late in life myself.
I love that.
In fact, I think I was in Africa on like this science journey, science communication journey, and we had these aerospace guy with us who was
Mhm.
explaining lift and drag and how airplanes work and everything, and he brought up the insect thing, and I was like, "Whoa, I never knew that." So I've known it maybe like 20 years, and 800,000 years old, so that's recent. Um,
You're a Viltrumite. You're a Viltrumite.
that's right. So they have this crazy physiology, but the physiology isn't going to help you when you're trying to fight space time itself. So, is there a way to space time has a curvature, and I'm going to manipulate it so that I would move the opposite of what space time would compel me to do? You could do that, but it requires energy and thrust. And so, where is this energy and thrust coming from? And the way they're talking about leveraging, like a satellite doesn't need energy and thrust, it's just falling the entire time, right? And so, if you go to a high enough altitude, it turns out that the rate at which you go around the Earth is the same rate that the Earth spins, rotates. So, you'll be in geosynchronous orbit over the same spot all the time. So, it looks like you're hovering even though you're falling across the earth. But you see, the element there is you have to be super far away for those periods to match. So here, what are they talking about? What is this force? What is this leverage? How do you use space in this way? I tell you, I used to dream of flying all the time when I was a kid, and I wish it could be true. But in this case, the folks of Vitrum are super amazing characters. I love the world they created. I love the storyline they created. I love the powers they created and how, they're not so powerful when they're young. They're not so durable when they're young. Their powers come in at a certain time. They grow. And then they become super violent jerks who are doing galactic conquest, right?
Yeah.
Great story. Make us fall in love with you and then reveal yourself to be evil.
Right.
But your technology don't fly. Give us something. Leverage is not enough. I need, yeah. Here's the question I have. So very, very rarely do superpowers in movies are they attributed to space-time manipulation. So Doctor Who does it. Star Trek did it a bit with the galactic mycelium, right? With the most recent Star Trek, where they could, travel through the galaxy and take these shortcuts. But I think that there is something there. I think there is something there for writers to take a look at the real nature of space time and create space time manipulation as a power, but do it in a physics way. And in a way, you'd kind of be like Magneto, right? Magneto manipulates the field of magnetism, which is a quantum field that is everywhere in space at all times. Well, the electromagnetic field, well, space time is the same thing, right? Space time is everywhere at all times. So if you have space time manipulation abilities, you're a powerful superhero or supervillain.
That is true. That is true. I hope aspiring writers and current writers are listening, because I think you just found your story advisor if you want to explore that.
There you go. There you
There
go.
you go.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting jumping off point for the story, right?
Yeah.
Because so now we're going to shift into how does their ability to fly play into how this story is told? Is it helpful? Does it fly? Does is there suspension of disbelief? No pun intended. um, and this is when I have to admit I'm having a hard time with this one. And I think it kind of goes back to, this idea that, again, like, as you said, many people sort of are familiar with this idea that, to simplify, an object in motion tends to stay in motion, an object at rest tends to stay at rest until something acts upon it. And, to me, that just feels like that's something I understand with my body. Like my
Yeah.
body knows that because we live it every day, right?
Yeah.
So on one hand, when, we sort of see Nolan explaining to Mark how Viltrumites fly and going through training and sort of giving him the breakdown of it all, when he says we don't need leverage, we can kind of just move through. I found myself almost like on a physical level reacting to that, going, but no, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's so I'm not gonna lie, the lack of propulsion, the need,
Yeah.
it really bumped me.
Yeah. 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 How do you
And
do
I
that?
mean, I've even read like, and just kind of doing some research on this, like somebody compared it to swimming, like almost if you think of them as moving through the air, almost like you would swim. But even with swimming, you're pushing against something. You're pushing
Exactly.
against the force of the water and it's
Right.
propelling you forward. And you
Right.
don't see them do that with the air.
No.
So
Or space, right? They could fly in space in the
right.
same way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was quite bumped by that. Um, so then the question becomes, well, okay, how does that factor into the larger piece of storytelling? When you were saying before, they don't really give you much of an explanation for how the flying happens. And in some ways, like sometimes I really want that broken down explanation, or at least like a little bit more. Sometimes I don't. And in this case, the fact that they didn't, I actually found helpful because it's animation, right? Where so many more things are possible. It's we're dealing with an alien race, and this is an alien race, the Viltrumites, where they're basically all powerful. A lot of people have actually compared them to Superman and to the folks from Krypton.
Except
Um,
that these ones are self genetically engineered and eugenicized into being who they are.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, there's a whole breeding program, which is kind of disturbing.
Yeah.
um, So yeah. So the fact that they, sort of have this, they're just from somewhere else, they're totally something else, and they don't break that down. At the end of the day, this is not a show. Some sci-fi shows, superhero shows really get into the hard science of it all. This one doesn't. That's not what it's actually trying to be. I mean, we're talking about a world where you have aliens, where you have demon detectives, where you have, fishman superheroes. You have a girl who gets younger every time she transforms into a giant monster. Like the way the show grounds itself isn't actually through the science of how all of these things happening. And in some ways, to me, it feels like if they had tried to do that, it would have gotten way too into the weeds. So instead, they kind of give you the rules for flying, which is what we see. when it's the rules of how it works, but not why it works. And that gets me to character. So what really grounds this show is the family dynamic that they create.
That's what I was going to ask you, because on the one hand, it's like, okay, I'm a sci-fi person. I want to see spectacle. I want to see, explosions and magic and this sort of thing.
You've got plenty of gore and explosions in this one.
Yeah. I want to see bodies
You've got a character called Rexplode, which is voiced by Jason Mantzoukas. I do actually have to just break in and say how amazing is the voice cast in this. I mean,
Right.
You have Steve Yeun voices Mark. You've got J.K. Simmons, who voices Nolan, Sandra Oh, who voices Debbie, his mom, and a whole slew of fantastic comedians and actors in the rest of it. But so you were saying, you want to see explosions. You want to see...
Well, yeah, but what I was getting at is ultimately we are human beings, and it also often comes down to the human story, the relationships between friends and family. And I that's what I see this show being, right? It's more that than all this stuff happens plenty. The stuff that typically happens, but that's not where the story's centered.
That's right. And to me, that's where, the flying, if we're talking specifically about the flying, that's where that comes in as a way to propel the story forward. Sorry, had to go there.
You did it again. Twice.
And what we see in, especially early on in the training montages or the training scenes that we see with Mark and his dad, that reveals character. And, it's interesting to watch those kind of early. There's one of them that happens in the first episode. There's a couple that happen later on throughout the first season where we, the audience, know that Omni-Man is actually a bad guy. And Mark and Debbie don't know this yet. Yeah. And so it's interesting to once you know he's a bad guy, to kind of go back and rewatch those and go, oh, what he's saying could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. But you see, so the Viltrumites are all about their superior nature. And that's why they believe they have the right to take over all of these different planets.
Even compared to themselves.
Yeah. And so when they're not an emotional group of aliens. And so when they do have kids, they are waiting to see if their kids are going to be strong. And if they are, then they're embraced by the culture. And if they're not, they're kind of discarded. And you see, you see pieces of this. For those who are listening, Hakeem just did a across the neck. Yeah, that. And you see this in the training, right? Because you see Nolan really pushing Mark. You see him not going easy on him. At one point, he literally punches him out to supposedly prep him.
And that's what's wrong with the country today. We're no longer allowed to punch out our kids. We got to get back to that.
Child services. I have someone over here for you. Yeah.
Hey, my son's a grown man. I told him, you're a grown man now.
But I also see, with Mark, it also reveals his personality a bit, because once he finds out that he has powers, he's always looked up to his dad. And then once he finds out that he's actually a Viltrumite and he's going to potentially come into these powers, he starts realizing them with this, great shot of him throwing some garbage away, and instead of going into the dumpster, he throws it and it goes out into space. And then he wakes up in the middle of the night to try to train. He really wants to get a jump on it. He really, really wants to please his dad. And in the first season, so much of that is about Mark trying to be his dad and live up to what his dad's expectations, which is something I think a lot of us can relate to. And then in the second season, once the reveal comes to him that his dad is actually a bad guy, it's about his fears of turning into his dad.
And I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. I am not buying it. This happens so much in sci-fi. This happens so much where there is some non-human, and then they find out that their real purpose is to eat the humans or use them for some other purpose. And they're like, I can't do that to my human friends. I'm not buying it.
What do you mean you're not buying it? I
was thinking about my relationship with my father, right, when I was a young man. And if my father reveals to me, it's sort of like, I went through this experience, right? My father took me to his homeland when I was 9 years old, Mississippi. And I had no idea where steaks and drumsticks and, chicken wings came from. And they were like, hey, we're about to slaughter some chickens. We got to kill a pig, this kind of stuff. And I was in shock,
Right.
But then it became, okay, this is what we do. Here's how we survive, right? We hunt, we farm, we process the animals. This is what we do. I didn't like it at first, but
Uh-huh.
it's our way of life. And I knew that I had to accept it. So if I grow up thinking one way, then my family reveals to me, no, here's our purpose. Here's why we're here. And I'm like, oh, it's my friends or my family? I feel like I'm going to go with my people and my family. I'm not going to be like, I'll be like, okay, spare my friends. I can keep those as pets. But,
Mhm. Well, but so you're saying you think Mark would have gone along with Nolan and his Viltrumite plan to take over Earth?
I think the average son probably would have. And I think that this trope plays itself out in many different franchises of, I can't turn on the humans, they're my pals. And then they go,
Mhm.
and what does that cause, right?
Mhm.
The deaths of the people who are your real family, typically.
Right. So, what I think is interesting there is something that was inherent in the comics, which they've really pulled out and leaned into and changed a bit actually in the show. And this is again, this is a show that in many ways has stayed very, very true to the comics. They've because of the one of the changes you can do when you go from comics to a live show is you can flesh out stories. One of the things I love about comics are that stories are told really efficiently. You only have so many panels in the book. Here, the writers have talked about the idea that like they can insert more things in between the panels in episodes. They can flesh out some of the minor characters. They can have longer story arcs for them. But one thing the comic did that Robert Kirkman has talked about is that it explored the idea of being biracial because his dad is from another planet and his mom is human, and then they've actualized that in the show because his mom is Korean American, and they've stayed true to that casting by casting Steve Yeun. So, well, on one hand, you say, well, your family presents this. This is our history. This is our heritage. You need to be true to that. That's only half of his history. That's only half of
Yeah,
his heritage.
you're
The
right.
other
You're right.
the other
You got
piece of his heritage is his mom. And I love that you like went there because I like finding my quotes. I
it.
One of the pieces that I read was from a site called Polygon, and this was by Tyler Lewin Tang, um, who talks about this idea of how they cast the show, why they went specific with it, and then how he related to that as an Asian American. It's not just colorblind casting in Invincible because the themes of heritage, family legacy, and finding individual personhood between two cultures were already rooted in Invincible's initial conceit. Though Mark wasn't originally conceived as Korean American, he was already a biracial character. His superpowers don't come from a mad science accident, a mutation, or a transformative experience like Peter Parker's. He was born with them. His father is from the planet Viltrum, and while his DNA is compatible with humans, he isn't human himself. He comes from a different culture complete with its own tradition and beliefs. As an Asian American, I see something inherently compelling and relatable about the push and pull between Mark's imposed duties as a superhero and his desires as a teenager. Viltrumites want to reshape the world in their image, like many Western cultures. And Mark, then goes on and challenges his dad's
Yeah,
beliefs because he's got both his mom's
yeah,
emotional side as a
right.
human acting on
Yeah,
him, and then his dad's let's take over the world and destroy all the humans, or actually not destroy all the humans. They just want to
that's
rule and be in charge.
yeah.
Yeah.
You just triggered me, Tamara, because I
Oh
went through that
no.
exact same thing. I went through the exact same transition.
Yeah.
Uh, and I'll tell you what it is, right? So I'm an American, grew up, I'm an African American, I'm a black man, right? And in the 90s, when I was in my 20s, my my mother's side of the family traces our heritage. All right. So our heritage, there was a oral tradition in our family because it was a family of immigrants that left West Africa, went to Europe, went to Caribbean, and came to the U.S. So I decided to go do the same thing with my dad's side of the family. Now, if you ever, for those of you out there who are listening, I was not born with the name I currently have. I changed my name when I was 26 years old. I was an Afrocentric young man. All right. So I started doing my father's side of the family
Hmm.
and discover for the first time that my dad is half white. Right?
Oh wow. He'd never
Yeah,
he'd never told you that?
no, it wasn't it. That didn't come up, right?
Okay.
I'd never met my grandparents. They had passed before I was
Mhm.
born, right? So not only did I get the information, but I also get a photograph.
I was
of
gonna
his
say, so you'd never seen pictures of your grandparents, obviously,
Well, I
then.
had not before then, right?
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and so then I have the picture now, right? And so
Mhm.
my both of them had Irish fathers. Okay, so now here it is. I was so Afrocentric, I changed my name to Hakeem Muata Oluseyi from James Edward Plummer Jr. Right, and now I'm like, wait a minute, who
Right.
am I? The next
Yeah.
thing I know, do you remember that song? Jump around, jump, jump, jump up and get down, right?
Mhm.
By
Yeah, yeah.
Everlast whatever
Yeah.
their crew was. Well, it has all this Irish imagery in it. So here it is. Before I find this out now, I'm a black man. That's all I know, right? No, I'm not Igbo. I'm not Hausa. I'm not Zulu, Kikuyu. I'm black man, right? There's people that don't really exist. And what happens is I see this imagery in this thing, knowing that I'm now a quarter Irish, right? Didn't know that before. And so I get this Irish pride. I'm like, hey, yeah.
Please tell me you started speaking with an Irish accent.
Oh, I did even better. I went to Ireland. I went to Ireland and could not understand anyone. They're
Bringing it back around to,
yeah,
does it fly? Does flight help with the story? Does it fly? That's where it's interesting, right? Like on a gut level, I watch the flying and I'm like, I don't know, something about me is going, yeah. But because of the way they use it to explore character, because of the way, like things like the training that we see happening, that is exactly, that kind of realizes in a narrative way this push pull between his parents, between different ways of looking at the world, that you are relating to here so intimately that I think a lot of us, feel on a gut level. That makes me go, well, maybe it does fly. So I think my answer for does flying aid the story in Invincible is kind of.
yeah. It fuels the relationship for sure, right?
Mhm.
And that's what the story is about. So yeah, let me say something to our fans out there because this is what someone's going to say in the comments. It's sci-fi. Of course, it doesn't follow the laws of physics, right? So that's still it has to make sense of the story, like you say, right? It has
Mhm.
to, and it would be helpful if they are going to give us an explanation, if they at
Mhm.
least put some thought into it, because there is this range you see in shows where some you can tell they really go deep and try to make things consistent with the laws of physics or even ideas that are out there, not necessarily proven ideas, but if the idea is out there, that means we know it's not inconsistent with known knowledge. So the possibility remains. And then there are those that just sweep it under the rug, give you no example whatsoever. Everybody's used to seeing heroes and villains fly. We don't have to explain a thing, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and again for this, like I don't mind that they didn't give us an explanation. It just bumped me that like what the thing they didn't give us an explanation for like intrinsically feels counterintuitive to like what my body understands as a humanoid. But that said,
Wait a minute,
now what?
fans and friends, y'all heard that too, right? I think we just got a confession from Tamara. Fess up. Because you didn't say as a human. You said as a humanoid. You called yourself a humanoid.
I'll
What are you
never
talking
tell. I'll never tell. But that's actually a good segue into our part 3, Does It Fly for the Vibes? Because whether I'm human or humanoid, perhaps from another place, um, the Viltrumites, as are revealed, have a very interesting point of view on the universe, which is that they are a superior race. They are here to take over different planets and different cultures because they can make them better. They can solve all of their ills. They can solve all of their problems. They should, by, I'll even call it divine right, my word, not theirs, but by divine right, essentially be able to assist weaker races in having a better
about?
living situation. And
This
that
sounds
is what
familiar.
Yeah, I know, right? So, my question for Does It Fly for the Vibes is, this question about, would you choose to surrender to an alien race if
Yeah,
they solved all of your ills, if life was better? And is that a legitimate point of view?
yeah.
So that's kind of where I want to go for Does It Fly for that? That's the
No,
vibe I want to explore.
yeah, I feel that idea because I think that that plays out over and over in history.
Mhm.
Um, Another thing, right? As my particular heritage, we're here in the 21st century, a quarter of the way through, and if you go back 100 years ago, you go back 100 years before that, to the extent that there is inequality in the world, it's still a different fight today than it was then, right? I can't look at 1925 and 2025. All things are the same. Even, they're very different, right? In 1825, they're very different. Um, and so, what am I getting at? I'll use the example of Germany in World War One.
Mhm.
So I used to listen to this podcast, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, where he would go into detail of different military campaigns and societies and this sort of thing. And one that I was drawn to because I didn't know anything about World War One was World
Mhm.
War One. And he laid out the perspective of the Germans. So what had happened was the French and the Russians had become allies, and Germany was not on good terms with either. And so they knew that if it became a two front war, if one of them made a move, they had to take out one quickly because they couldn't fight them both simultaneously. And so we know the guy getting, the guy and his wife getting shot in the car. But what that causes is Russian troop movements, which the Germans figured, oh, we can attack France first because Russia is going to have to take some time to get their troops moved. But once the Russian troops move, they're like, oh, we have no choice now. We got to go, right? Because we have no time. It's going to be a two front war, so we better just pull the trigger and go. And what happens? They do all of this to prevent getting conquered.
Mhm.
And ultimately, they get conquered. Their worst fear comes about
Right.
with mass loss of life, mass loss of cities, so much destruction and death. Now we look up 2025, Germany's doing pretty darn well. Even after the worst case scenario happened twice, right? Or if not three times, right? You can say the rise of Hitler is the worst case scenario, then losing World War II is bad for the Germans, right? What they went through. But the point is that they looked at this situation and they said, we can't surrender because then we'd be conquered. And that's the worst case scenario. But that's exactly what happened. And yet they're okay. These worst things, these worst outcomes when it comes to, geopolitical conflict, the worst outcome, yeah, there were times where it meant complete massacre, it meant horrible things happening. But then there are other times when the worst case scenario occurs, but you bounce back really quickly and you go on to bigger and better things. So if the aliens come, let me tell you what's really going to happen. Somebody's going to look at them and say, hey, you know what? They got more powerful than us. So we're going to partner with them and defeat our human enemies. And then the aliens conquer us all, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting too when you think about it, when you think about government and different forms of government, right? Like I worked on a conference, an event last summer where we had a bunch of different panels on the nature of democracy and the state of democracy. And one of the questions that came up is that there are places in Latin America where what I'll call more authoritarian, totalitarian style governments have taken over. And the folks who live under them, I'm not going to say they've welcomed it, but they have cleaned up gang warfare. They have given out, checks of a certain amount so that, it's not a universal basic income, but there is suddenly some money to take care of some basics and things like that. And yet the people have chosen essentially to trade some of their freedoms for these better living conditions. Is
Yeah.
that good? Is that bad?
Yeah.
I don't
Oh,
know. I
like
mean, they're
probably.
lucky not to live under those conditions, so it's
Yeah.
hard to answer if you're not there. But it is
Yeah.
an interesting question about like if our alien overlords came in and said, "Hey, we're going to clean up X, Y, and Z, but
Yeah.
we rule your planet."
Right.
Where's the line? Where do you go? No, no, no,
It's
no.
tough. right? Suffering is
Yeah.
the line as I see. So if it's not if you're not actually suffering, because most of the time you are, right? It's sort of like, you're talking about government. Who is it? Socrates or, one of these philosophers that said, you could have rule by a single entity, you could have rule by the few, or you could have rule by the many. And each one has a good case and a bad case. And in democracy, right? Democracy is the bad case of rule by the many, and polity is the good case of rule by the many. But I tell you, we say democracy. Once I started traveling the world and in the developing world, when you go to a country where there's, a bunch of different tribes, democracy means the largest tribes control the resources, right? And if there's not enough resources to go around, that means you find yourself in a state of steady conflict. So when people ask me, what's the best form of government? I say rule of just law, right? You have rule of law, but it has to be a just law. Whether that's a single, a few, or the many. Now, historically, the best chance for getting just law, rule of just law, is in a democracy, right? But it isn't. That's not the necessary condition. The necessary condition, as I see it, is rule of just law. And what does that have to do with Invincible? Oh,
Well,
the alien invasion. Yeah.
Yeah, alien invasion, and the idea that the Viltrumites actually think they are ruling by just law. Like, and an example, is in season 2, Mark's on a date, because of course we always have that lovely tension between, like, I want to be a superhero, I want to be a teenager, I want to be a superhero, I want to be a teenager. And he's on a date, and he is confronted by Anissa, who's a Viltrumite. I mean, at this point, Mark knows his whole heritage. He's confronted by Anissa, who basically, is trying to encourage him to take on his dad's mission of getting the Earth to join the Viltrum Empire. And as they're having this conversation, a kaiju attacks. And Mark, who's still coming into his powers, figuring them out, and, has essentially lost somebody to train him at this point because his dad's not around anymore, can't quite defeat the kaiju, and she's able to. And, suddenly the Earthlings are safe. And she's like, look, see how weak these people are? We are here to protect them. They would be better off under our rule. So it's a
But
really...
Dad took it a step too far, right? There was that one dialogue where he tells the son, dude, we live for like thousands of years.
Yeah.
Everybody you know is going to die.
I do love your mother, but she's more like a pet to me.
I know.
Like what?
Oh,
Wrong thing to say to the son, Dad.
Wrong thing to say to your son. So when it comes to like the vibe check on this, and does it fly to be ruled by alien overlords? I think it depends on your current state and what they're promising.
And I think it depends on, have we actually been defeated? So it's if you're showing up, I don't care what you bring in. No, I'm not bowing the knee. That's not happening. I don't care what you got. But once you're sufficiently conquered, when do you give up the rebellion, right? So, if you think about the wars as Europe went through medieval Europe and all these time periods, it changed so much. But yet you look at the Europeans today, and all these identities are, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, I'm that. And you have to study to realize, oh yeah, they're all mixed up. They're not, they're different, but at the same time, they're all mixed up. So whatever was going on 1,000 years ago, what it yields today, you got to let 1,000 years ago go and live today on today's terms. I am constantly fascinated by us as a species in terms of what our imaginations have allowed us to, the world we've been able to create. I am not a naysayer about humans and civilization. Oh, we're doomed and we're destroying. I mean, yeah, there's loss of biodiversity and all that, but I think that the planet, is pretty robust and it's going to keep on going, and we're going to respond. It's going to be ups and downs, but ultimately, when those Vituriums or whoever they're called show up, we're going to kick their ass. That's what's going to happen. We're all going to be bionic cyborgs,
So your definitive answer on would rule by an alien overlord fly if it made life better?
They're going to have to take it because I am not giving it. Yeah, I'll slap him right back in outer space.
Although I will say, do not underestimate the fury of a 4'11" ginger. So
That's
for
or
those of
any
you who are
ginger.
for those of you who are listening and not watching, that would be me. I am a 4'11" redhead. So we want to say thank you to all of you for listening, for watching, for tuning in to Does It Fly? We drop new episodes every Friday where we discuss your favorite conceits. If you've got an idea for a topic that you would like to have us cover, definitely let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this show as well, and your thoughts on whether you would give in to alien invaders or not. And Hakeem, where can they find us online?
They can find us on our website, doesitflypod.com. They can find us on TikTok if it still exists. Does It Fly Pod. And Instagram, Does It Fly Pod. And, if you're listening to podcasts on Spotify or another app, you can also find us there. So when you're riding in your car, you can have some smooth Tamara Krinsky in your ear.
Ooh, well, thank you, Dr. O. Thank you for a lovely episode, and we will see you all next time.
We gotta fly. Peace.